In this week, we will review some basic epidemiological measures. Include measures of disease frequency, measures of association, and measures of potential impact. We will also review how to compare measures among different populations. Epidemiologists always want to quantify frequency of diseases in populations. Populations can be closed or open. Closed populations mean that membership in the group is permanent. For example, people who were in the World Trade Center on September 11. This population will never gain new members. Open populations, on the other hand, have non-permanent membership, and membership is defined by a situation or a state that might change. An individual will be a member of the population as long as it has the transient state, for example, living in Alberta. Majority of measures of disease have numerators and denominators. There are three factors that should be considered when measuring the frequency of disease. One is the number of people affected by the disease, or cases. Two, the size of the population. And three, the length of time. There are three types of calculations that help to describe and compare measures of disease frequency: ratios, proportions, and rates. A ratio is one number divided by another. Individuals in the numerator can be different of those in the denominator. This measure is often read as a percentage. A proportion is also one number divided by another, but individuals in the numerator are a subset of those in the denominator. Proportions are often expressed as percentages. A rate is also a number divided by another, but time is an integral part of the denominator. The measure of time in the denominator, or person years, is what makes a number a rate. The calendar time period is the same in both the numerator and the denominator of a rate. A rate is a measure of how quickly something of interest might happen. For example, the number of new cases of Parkinson's disease per 1,000 person years of follow-up. We will explain later what this concept of person years means. Epidemiological measures can be classified in measures of disease frequency and measures of association. Measures of disease frequency include incidence and prevalence, and measures of association can be divided in absolute and relative measures. Incidence measures new cases of a disease over a period of time in a population who is at risk of developing the disease. Incidence takes into account the specific amount of time that members of a population are followed until they develop the disease. It's a measure that can help to evaluate the effectiveness of programs that prevent disease. There are two types of incidence measures: cumulative incidence and incidence rate. Cumulative incidence, or incidence risk, is the proportion of individuals in a population who develop the disease over a specified period of time. The numerator is a subset of the denominator. Note that the candidate population is comprised of people who are at risk of getting the disease. Time is not an integral part of this proportion. However, the period of time for which the proportion applies should be somehow stated. This measure is commonly used in fixed populations with small losses to follow up. Let's suppose that we want to estimate the average risk of uterine cancer in a group of women. We start with 1,000 women in the group, but 100 of them have hysterectomies, so technically they are not at risk of developing uterine cancer, leaving 900 at risk. We follow these women for 10 years and observe 10 new uterine cancer cases. After making some calculations, we find out that the 10-year average risk of developing uterine cancer is 1.1%. Now, incidence rate or incidence density describes the number of new cases of disease that arise during a specific person time. The numerator is the same to that of the cumulative incidence, but the difference between the two measures lies in the denominator. The incidence rate includes time in the denominator, and therefore it's a true rate. Incidence rate is the most sophisticated measure of incidence, and it accounts for losses to follow-up, competing risks, and dynamic turnovers. What is person time? Person time is the actual time at risk that people in the population contributed to the study. It can be expressed in years, months, or days. The denominator for the incidence rate changes over the study, as the people originally at risk will develop the disease during the observation period. In this graph, we can see how many days individuals in the study remain free of the event, which is the event would be myocardial infarction. Person time would be the sum of the total time that all individuals contributed to the study. In this case, the unit will be person days. For example, individual A contributed with 53 days, individual B with 70 days, C with 24 days, and so on, for a total of 233 person days. This number would become now the denominator for the incidence rate. The total number of individuals who became cases over the period of time were individual A, C, and E. Therefore, we can see after applying the formula that the incidence rate of myocardial infarction would be 0.0127 cases per person day. And if we multiply the numerator and the denominator by 1,000, the incidence rate would be expressed as 12.7 cases per 1,000 person days. Let's take a look again to our example on uterine cancer. Now we want to estimate the rate of uterine cancer, and we have 10 new cases in 900 women that contributed with 10 years of observation. This is 9,000 person time years. After calculations, we find out that the rate of uterine cancer is 11.1 per 1,000 person years. The incidence risk provides good evidence for causality when the condition is uncommon and the population is closed. In a dynamic population with many people entering and leaving, or when the condition is very common, the incidence rate is preferred. This is because this measure accounts for the time that the subjects in the population spend at risk of developing the condition. Prevalence measures the frequency of existing disease. It is the proportion of the total population that has the disease. This measure is particularly useful for evaluating healthcare needs and planning the provision of health services. And it's particularly important for evaluating chronic conditions. There are two types of prevalent measures: point prevalence and period prevalence. Think of point prevalence as a snapshot of the frequency of disease, and period prevalence as the frequency of the disease over a pre-specified period of time. Point prevalence is the proportion of the population that has the disease at a single point in time. The measure is useful for assessing the status of the population and good for measuring chronic conditions, but it doesn't make much sense to use it for conditions that are acute or of short duration. Using our example about hysterectomy and uterine cancer, let's suppose that we recruited 1,000 women and we found out that 100 had hysterectomies. The prevalence of hysterectomy in this population would be 10%. Period prevalence measures the number of new and existing cases in a time period divided by the size of the population for the same time period. Some factors might increase the prevalence in a population. For example, a longer duration of the disease, or improvements in diagnosis and reporting, or prolongation of life without a cure. Factors that decrease the prevalence might include improvement in cure methods, or a shorter duration of the disease, or an increment in the number of cases of people with the disease who die. Prevalence is influenced by the incidence and the duration of the disease. For example, about a decade ago, the average duration of lung cancer was about 6 months. Therapy was ineffective, and almost all lung cancer cases died. From the time of diagnosis, the average survival was about 6 months, so the prevalence of lung cancer was fairly low. In contrast, diabetes has a long average duration because it cannot be cured, but it can be controlled with medications, so the average duration of diabetes is long and the prevalence is fairly high. The relationship between prevalence and incidence can be visualized by thinking of inflow and outflow from a cistern. The fullness of the cistern would be analogous to prevalence. Raindrops might represent incidence or the rate at which new cases are being added to the population and become prevalent cases. Water also flows out, analogous to removal of prevalent cases because they die or because they are cured from the disease. Imagine that incidence, or the rainfall, and the rate of the cure or death are initially equal. If so, the height of water in the cistern will remain constant. If outflow from the cistern, meaning the rates of cure or death among prevalent cases, remain constant and the rainfall increases, then the height of the water in the cistern will rise. On the other hand, if the incidence declines, then the water level will fall. If we start from a steady state again, and the rate of rainfall remains constant, but the outflow increases, then the height of the water, this is the prevalence, will fall. On the other hand, if incidence is held constant, but the outflow falls, that is to say that the lives of prevalent cases are prolonged, but they are not cured, then the height of the water will rise. Before we finish the first part of this lecture, I would like to briefly mention some commonly used measures of disease frequency in epidemiology. They include the crude mortality rate, cause and age-specific mortality rates, years of potential life lost, live birth and birth defect rates, morbidity rates, and finally attack, case fatality, and survival rates.